So this video is going to be helping you tell the difference between the ENFP and the INFP. And I'm actually going to be taking something of a different approach for this one because, let's be honest, the strongest area of confusion when people are trying to tell whether they are one or the other is actually in the nature of their extroverted intuition. And this confusion, to be honest, is actually quite reasonable because plenty of INFPs seem to have more extroverted intuition than they do introverted feeling. They even relate more to it. And plenty of ENFPs tend to have more introverted feeling, again, than they do extroverted intuition. And again, they tend to relate more to that particular function. And this causes a great degree of mistyping between each of these types. Because when you're just trying to measure a type's cognitive function based on how much of it they seem to be having or identify with having, mistyping is going to occur. Because the degree to which we relate to our functions and the degree to which we even use our functions tends to vary from situation to situation anyway. And as such, it is a far more logical route when trying to determine the difference between the INFP and the ENFP to instead look at the attitudes of their functions, the nature of these functions. Because both of these types perceive extroverted intuitive information in the external world, and both of these types have an extroverted thinking codec adjoined to this extroverted intuitive lens. Therefore, both of these types tend to form objective associations in the external atmosphere. However, the ENFP has each of these functions in the dominant position. This means that ENFP tends to spend a lot more time interacting with and acting upon these perceived components and associations than they do passively observing them. And the INFP is the exact opposite to this. They are much more passive in their employment of extroverted intuition, and they use it in a much more observational and divergent capacity. The ENFP's extroverted intuition and extroverted thinking are convergent in nature. This is an area in which they take responsibility. They act upon this world that they are perceiving. And therefore, this type much more naturally uses these functions in order to make executive decisions, forward plan, create projects, sometimes finish projects, jump into an extroverted, intuitive, extroverted thinking atmosphere and start improvising upon it, spend less time observing the relationship between these perceived patterns and more time making assumptions of that relationship, more time forming hypotheses and then testing out these hypotheses in reality. And indeed, a really good method of telling the difference between the INFP and the ENFP in their use of extroverted intuition and extroverted thinking is in a debate setting. Because the ENFP will oftentimes be putting forward strongly held opinions. The ENFP will oftentimes be expressing confidence in their conclusions. And indeed, far more often than the INFP, making grand leaps of logic and stating what is not necessarily proven to be true. And just as the ENFP's extroverted intuitive and extroverted thinking are convergent in nature, these functions within the INFP are divergent, and therefore the energy the ENFP will be expending into making decisions, influencing the world, the INFP will be putting into observing the world around them. And whereas the ENFP will generally be creating their own systems and rule sets, the INFP is much more likely to observe the rule sets created by another person. The INFP oftentimes thrives, at least when they're trying to be industrious, within a criteria, within a pre-established methodology that they can follow. And whereas, of course, both of these types are highly individualistic, owing to the introverted feeling that we will get to in a moment, the INFP's rebellion will oftentimes be a lot more dissociative and passive-aggressive than oftentimes the altogether more active rebellion of the ENFP. And again, this is owing to the divergent nature of the INFP's primary extroverted functions. And again, whereas the ENFP is more likely to rush decisions, the INFP's divergent extroverted thinking, extroverted intuition is much more likely to carefully weigh up all of the different options and spend much more time balancing these different possibilities alongside each other. And this leads me to another point off the back of that one. The ENFP generally finds it a lot easier to dip into extroverted sensing from an extroverted intuitive position than the INFP does. And yes, the ENFP, while they will be preliminarily speaking, observing the external world around them and seeing all the different possibilities, they are very happy to pick one of these possibilities and go with it. And when they do pick it, they oftentimes lock into extroverted sensing in order to really hone in on that particular option. And when they do this, they can even inherit a kind of tunnel vision, whereby they become blind to the other options they were previously weighing up. And indeed, this is when the ENFP can fit much more into that classic judging dichotomy of MBTI. By comparison, extroverted intuition is the INFP's authority function, and therefore its divergent nature is practically forcing the INFP to reconcile all of these different possibilities alongside each other. And it actually makes it very, very difficult for the INFP to make a decision, because in order to make such a decision, the INFP must oftentimes pick one of these options at the expense of all of the others. Coupled with the INFP's natural idealism within a convergent introverted feeling position, making a decision in such a way can actually cause the INFP to feel like they are missing out. And it is not in the least bit unusual to hear an INFP proclaiming that they want to do absolutely everything, that their ideal job or vocation or hobby is one which combines everything together and yet keeps everything simultaneously separate. Because the INFP wants to entertain all the options. They don't want to go down a single rabbit hole, because as soon as they are in that tunnel, all of the other options become closed off to them. And therefore the INFP is oftentimes more likely to be a jack of all trades than the ENFP. Because the ENFP, yes, they may inherit a lot of different skills throughout their life, but they tend to go through phases of doing so. They'll spend a certain amount of time pursuing one skill, and then once that novelty may have worn off, they'll be pursuing the next goal. And that goal isn't necessarily always going to be related to the last one. But again, being an intuitive dominant, and yes, this does include introverted intuition, the ENFP oftentimes wants to synergize and combine all of these different pursuits and skill sets together. Whereas again, the INFP, while they want to have everything at once, they are more of a mindset where all of these possibilities are being reconciled continuously with each other. And thus, unlike an intuitive dominant, the INFP will not be forcing all of these things together. And in some sense, it can be argued that the reason the INFP does this is because they do not want to taint any of these different options, because as soon as you force another option into another one, it's a kind of compromise. And while this is somewhat crude, and the degree to which it is true depends entirely upon the fluidity of the central dominant axis, aka the degree to which, for example, an INFP can rotate on an axis to become an ESTJ, it tends to be the ENFP more comfortable with making decisions, and the INFP more comfortable with weighing up all of the different options. Because yeah, the ENFP dips into extroverted sensing from an extroverted intuitive standpoint, whereas the INFP tends to really struggle to do this. The INFP is perpetually encapsulating all of the external world and really struggling to hone into a specific thing. Yes, when the INFP is really focused on a task, they can become very much shut off from the outside world, or even shut off to their own body. But even when they retain this very focused state, they are still having this pull and tug between extroverted sensing and extroverted intuition, just because they lose their sense of reality. Just because they become disconnected from their body to some degree does not mean they lose extroverted intuition. Because no matter how much an INFP is focused on a particular task, they are still in a constant state of brainstorming, of troubleshooting, of analysing, observing the interaction between all of the components they are perceiving. And whether this extroverted intuitive perspective is encapsulating a large or small space within the external world, what they are perceiving within the space they are occupying is still very broad and holistic. And finally, in regards to the nature of each of these types of respective extroverted intuitive, extroverted thinking, lens codec relationships, it is very important to bear in mind the ENFP is a lens dominant, whereas the INFP is a codec dominant. And this gives a very different slant to the cognitive predisposition of each of these types. Being a lens dominant type, the ENFP really does tend to prioritize the novelty of the experience. They are constantly chasing the new and the unexplored, and oftentimes quite happy to insert a level of chaos into the equation, just to make the experience more rich. Yes, the ENFP has a very altruistic agenda, and this will oftentimes, as the authority function does, being introverted feeling in this instance, rein in the otherwise chaotic agenda of the dominant stack. But even with this agenda, the ENFP tends to be much more of a, should I say, chaos junkie than the INFP. The ENFP will oftentimes be making assumptions, they'll be stating opinions as fact. They have a higher proclivity towards behaving somewhat erratically. And with the constant forward motion of an extroverted intuitive primary dialogue, the ENFP really does spend a lot more time, and I mean a lot more time, chasing new novelties in the exterior than they do perhaps reflecting upon the past in the interior. And while this by no means applies to all ENFPs, I'd even say it applies more to a minority of ENFPs than it does a majority. There is a danger for everyone of this type to fall into a kind of pattern whereby they're so constantly preoccupied with external novelties, new plans and new experiences, that they very much forget to consult or even actively evade an interaction with a past tense internal dialogue. It is not entirely unheard of for an ENFP to be taking on so many different responsibilities and chasing so many different new and interesting projects that they completely forget about their own emotions. And as such, when this type does not actively take time out of the day in order to look after themselves and enjoy perhaps a more meditative state, to completely burn out. Because again, the novelty, the excitement is the priority here as a lens dominant type. Whereas the INFP, by contrast, is a codec dominant type. and therefore the INFP tends to prioritize order and adherence to value over they do a pursuit of novelty. And yes, both of these types will, to some degree, value both of these experiences, and this will very much fluctuate from person to person. But the primary cognitive predisposition of the INFP is towards order. And as such, the primary axis of the INFP is not extroverted intuition and introverted sensing, like the ENFP, but rather introverted feeling and extroverted thinking. And this extroverted thinking oppositional function makes the INFP much more perfectionistic than the ENFP tends to be. The ENFP is oftentimes much more happy to improvise and just insert energy or even chaos into the external world and just see what happens. Whereas the INFP, to ensure a more favourable outcome and to avoid chaos, tends to abide by an extroverted thinking divergent framework. And it is therefore little reason that the INFP so often mistypes as an INFJ. Because insofar as making decisions, sure, the INFJ is much more comfortable doing this, but the INFJ is significantly more chaotic than the INFP. The INFP tends to be more conscientious, whereas the ENFP and the INFJ tend to be much more industrious. And in comparing the conscientiousness of each of these types, because let's be honest, an ENFP is just as likely to receive a J in their acronym as an INFP is, it is helpful to know that the ENFP tends to be much more industrious, whereas the INFP tends to be much more perfectionistic. And each of these different traits fall within a conscientious criteria. And considering the fact that the INFP is a codec dominant alongside the divergent nature of their extroverted thinking and extroverted intuition, it is little surprise, therefore, that the INFP is much more comfortable following instructions and abiding by a framework than the ENFP is. So to summarize that section of this video, the ENFP is much more likely to make decisions upon the extroverted, intuitive, extroverted thinking world. As a lens-dominant type, they tend to be much more chaotic in their interactions with the world, and as they are oftentimes more willing and able to dip into extroverted sensing from an extroverted, intuitive standpoint, the ENFP can really lock into the task, really absorb the stimuli of the outside world, and even inherit a kind of tunnel vision along the way whereby they have previously picked, convergently speaking, one of the extroverted, intuitive possibilities and completely decided to run with it, follow it down the rabbit hole, and become perhaps blind to all of the other possibilities that may have presented themselves beforehand, or even the ongoing possibilities that might rise up during the process. By comparison, the INFP's extroverted thinking, extroverted intuition is much more observational by nature, much more passive. They put a lot more energy than the ENFP tends to in observing all of the different interactions and allowing all of the different possibilities that rise up as a result to exist alongside each other. Again, unlike the INFP tends to struggle making assumptions and making decisions, and oftentimes, rather than risk compromising their ideals by picking one of the options at the expense of the others, an INFP will oftentimes prefer to abide by the decision of another person, so long as they relate to and respect that particular individual. And finally, again, unlike the INFP tends to have difficulty really dipping into the here and now, the extroverted sensing concrete world. And while they can somewhat lose themselves in an activity, this tends not to be at the expense of an ongoing extroverted intuitive consultation. Which leads me neatly to the second half of this video, because just as each of these types share extroverted intuition and extroverted thinking, they also share introverted sensing and introverted feeling. And just as with the aforementioned lens-codec pairing, in each of these types, introverted feeling is connected to a very concrete introverted sensing lens. However, the introverted feeling and introverted sensing of the INFP is convergent in nature, and therefore this is a world in which they are highly responsible. They're much more willing to make decisions and assumptions within this world than they were the former. Because both of these types have a very specific introverted sensing lens and oftentimes feel a very concrete sense of limbic self, as opposed, of course, to objective self, which oftentimes requires a level of external frameworking. In this area is actually where the INFP tends to be much more uncertain. And as a result of this concrete sense of self, they tend to be quite set in their values. They tend to know where the boundaries are and tend to have little difficulty maintaining their individuality in the midst of a status quo. They are happy to stand out, as it were, from the pack. And of course, the external way of expressing this is going to be relative again to those extroverted functions, and therefore the ENFP oftentimes will be much more outwardly and aggressively rebellious in this instance, whereas the INFP is altogether more likely to simply detach themselves from the situation, to dissociate, if you will. Owing to the convergent nature of the introverted feeling, introverted sensing within the INFP, they tend to be in an ongoing process of relation to the world around them. Not only are they observing the myriad of different associations and possibilities within the external landscape, but they are actively limbically relating to all of these different possibilities. As they are in control of their feeling, it is not unusual for the INFP to be able to suppress a certain emotion and consult it more thoroughly later. For the INFP to be able to tolerate another person's presence, and over time even begin to mold themselves to another culture, mold themselves to a different set of criteria, because convergent feeling is highly adaptive in nature. And again, with the INFP having feeling within a convergent control, their relational dialogue is highly conscious in nature. Not only can they relate to another person's position, but they can oftentimes choose and hop between different perspectives in order to make an informed decision. And again, owing to the convergent nature of this introverted feeling, introverted sensing, dominant stack, the INFP is oftentimes a lot more comfortable making assumptions as to the emotional state of another person than they are making assumptions as to what is objectively true or false. Because again, the INFP is comparably more scrupulous than the ENFP. And the introverted sensing, introverted feeling codec lens pair of the ENFP is a complete opposite of this because it is divergent in nature. Therefore, the ENFP tends to be comparably more unadaptive. And while they are in many ways equally empathetic and relational, they do not always pick and choose what perspectives they take. More often times, the introverted sensing, introverted feeling of the ENFP is a driving force pushing forward a rational agenda. And by comparison to the INFP, the ENFP tends to be a lot more less naturally tolerant. They have a lot more difficulty, naturally speaking, of course, relating to a myriad of different relational perspectives. And generally speaking, the ENFP does not adapt their character to other people in so much as other people adapt their character to the ENFP. Because the introverted feeling authority of the ENFP instills the type with a need for absolute uncompromising authenticity. And the authenticity needs to be externalized. And while the INFP will equally value oftentimes such authenticity, they will not necessarily be externally demonstrating it so much. And it is not entirely unheard of for the INFP to mold their external character while remaining very much true and consistent to their internal values. And just as a passing note, the INFP tends to be a lot more comfortable making decisions that concern their identity, whereas the identity of the ENFP tends to be a lot more uncompromising even to themselves. The INFP spends a lot more conscious time observing their own emotional state, and therefore they tend to be more actively monitoring whether or not they need rest, for example, whether or not emotions might be overflowing, whether or not the continued pursuit of a course of action is good for their own longevity and mental well-being. The ENFP, by comparison, can get completely caught up with any particular plan they happen to be following. And it is not unusual for the ENFP to only become aware of a certain emotional dissonance when their emotions start to overflow. And just as how the ENFP much more naturally activates extroverted sensing from an extroverted intuitive position, the INFP much more naturally and indeed confidently dips into introverted thinking from an introverted feeling perspective. So when people talk about the primary dialogue of the INFP, they are being massively and horrendously oversimplistic if they are just limiting this internal dialogue to an emotional state. Because in reality, the INFP spends just as much time dipping into introverted thinking as they do consulting their more raw and tangible sense of emotion. The INFP's primary dialogue, much like any other introvert, is highly rationalistic in nature. They are seeking to understand. They are seeking to entertain different perspectives, different logical conclusions. And these logical conclusions are not all sought after in the extroverted intuitive world. Indeed, a lot of them are sought after in the introverted thinking, introverted intuitive world. Because as the INFP tends to dip into introverted thinking, they tend to dip also into introverted intuition. And this gives the INFP a highly philosophical and existential nature. And while of course both of these types do gravitate towards the existential and profound, the INFP tends to convergently instigate such dialogue in a much more conscious and indeed even confident fashion. And it is not entirely unheard of, owing to the differing orientations of each of these types' respective dominant stacks, for the INFP to gravitate much more towards internalized theory, and for the ENFP's logical cogitations to have a much more pragmatic underpinning. And just generally speaking, you could say the INFP is more likely to have a more philosophical perspective, whereas the ENFP is much more likely to have a more political perspective. But again, the INFP has a lot easier of a time dipping into introverted thinking and indeed introverted intuition from a dominant position, particularly from limbic center, because when the ENFP is instigating such dialogue, it tends to be much more detached from the limbic center. And this leads me to touch on the different pathways through which these types activate thinking in the first place. Having the thinking function in the convergent position, the ENFP tends to be actively rationalizing their own emotions, rationalizing their opinion, and absent a level of emotional charge, applying an oftentimes altogether hazier introverted thinking, introverted intuitive paradigm in a more cool and detached manner. Whereas by contrast, the INFP's introverted thinking is oftentimes engaged, especially in a more conscious manner, almost entirely from an introverted feeling perspective. And actually it's quite important I mention this. As the INFP dips into introverted thinking, they tend to dip also into introverted intuition. Both the lens and the codec dip into the opposing end of the continuum. Similarly, when the ENFP decides to dip into extroverted sensing from an extroverted intuitive position, they tend to dip also into extroverted feeling. This is why the ENFP tends to prefer a one-on-one social situation. However, neither of these types tend to dip all the way into the other end of the extreme, and therefore, as the INFP dips into introverted thinking, they're not dipping into a broad, holistic introverted intuition just as the ENFP would have, but rather somewhere in between intuition and sensing. And therefore, when the INFP is balancing the different perspectives and possibilities and trying to hone in into making an introverted thinking decision, there tends to be a combination of precision and holistic thought. And therefore, the ENFP's thinking pattern tends to be a lot more broad and plethoric, whereas the INFP's thinking pattern tends to occupy a kind of best of both worlds, if you like, a situation, whereby they might have difficulty really locking onto a specific internal detail, while perhaps having an equally hard time consulting the vast plethoric perspective that would be more akin to an introverted intuitive dominant. So insofar as trying to tell these types apart based upon differing levels of consciousness, the ENFP has a highly unconscious and yet oftentimes highly potent introverted thinking, which is quite broad and plethoric in nature, whereas the INFP oftentimes has a highly unconscious extroverted sensing. And while they can indeed experience the moment and the concrete world quite intensely, they would not necessarily be doing so in a highly conscious manner. And generally, it is more likely for the INFP to feel somewhat disembodied and disconnected from reality than the ENFP. And to be honest, in terms of extroverted feeling, these types tend to be quite similar. When an INFP is extremely comfortable with somebody, they may be more likely to actively change the person's emotional state for its own sake, being as they are a convergent extroverted feeler. Whereas the ENFP is confident as they are changing the emotions of another person just as a happy byproduct, if you like, of their own authenticity, tend to, even in a one-on-one situation, prefer to abide by the emotions of another person more than they do actively seek to change them. But it is important to note that when the ENFP is tolerating another person, it is on the basis of an extroverted feeling sub-authority. And therefore, when they are tolerating, they are not necessarily adapting their own much more concrete and unmoving sense of self. Similarly, when the INFP is adapting to another person, they are much more adapting to it on an intrinsic limbic internal level than they are simply abiding by extroverted feeling for its own sake. So thank you so much for watching that video. I hope it was useful, and definitely be sure to share it with anyone who you think might benefit from it. If you haven't already done so, be sure to click that subscribe button down below. And if you like the video, be sure to leave a like down below because it really does help the channel grow, develop and reach new audiences. And before I leave you, just a few call to actions. I do have a dedicated CPT ebook, so if you're interested in more of the terminology, definitely check that out. If you're still uncertain about your type after watching this video, I do offer a dedicated CPT type service across multiple tiers. And finally, be sure to check out the CPT Patreon if you're interested in supporting the channel on that additional level. But as usual, I just want to let you all know that your support over this medium is already massively, massively appreciated. So thank you once again for watching the video, especially if you made it this far. You are awesome, and I'll be back in a few days' time. For now, take care of yourself.